We are. Just to be clear, this is not, it's not here for the pantomime, that's next week, so if you thought, you stole my joke! There was a gag coming which got ruined. I've been practicing it all day, but, oh yes I have. So that's the gags out of the way, and I've got also invite Pete Can up on stage just for a quick plug of another event. They normally involve socialism, but I don't know if that's the case.
Oh yeah, just a quick plug for a play, not by me. No. But unfortunately I'm in it. It's a play by Tim Waite, sitting there. It's on March 21st. It's a black comedy called The Passing of Mr. Green. And tickets will be on sale next week, hopefully, very soon. So look out for it. There's a matinee and an evening on March 21st. The Passing of Mr. Green. Please come.
Where?
Where is it, Pete?
What's that?
I said, where is it? Here.
It's here! It's here!
Okay, I'll introduce the speaker now. Most of you have come across him before, and the numbers we've had for this event have been extraordinary. It was a sellout last night. And I suppose the big question is, and you can ask yourself it, is it the man or is it the material? I don't know. Okay, but so Maurice is, for those of you who don't know, Maurice is a well-established local historian and enthusiast. He brings a real panache to the subject. Some have likened him to the Mick Jagger of local history. So again, you can make your minds up after you hear him. So it'll be a 45-minute chat, and then we'll have a little interval. You can have a chat about whether he's more Mick or Keith, so you can see what they think. But I'll hand the floor over to Maurice, and we'll take him there. There will be a Q&A afterwards, by the way, yeah? So we'll try and organise that. Okay, thank you, Maurice. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a very nice comparison, Mick Jagger. I'm not sure if Mick has to put the chairs out before his gigs. That's fine. That's okay. That's all right. It's all, I'm keeping it real. Keeping it real. Thank you all very much for turning up this evening. I was a bit worried earlier on when the rain was lashing down, and I was thinking, crikey, there might not be such a big crowd. But there's an excellent crowd here tonight. So thank you all very much for venturing out. And to be honest, my first impressions are, you are so much better than last night. So much better than last night. I was going to say, there's nobody here who's here last night as well, is there? I was thinking, you've got to get out more if you come for 2 nights. So this evening, what I'm going to do is we're going to have probably about 35, 45 minutes of me talking, then there'll be a nice break. And hopefully you won't all depart. You'll come back afterwards, and there'll be another sort of half an hour, 45 minutes, talking about Slade camps, talking about Slade Park, and I'll explain the difference between those two terms as we go along. But really, what I'm going to talk about tonight is a local history project, a history project that I didn't think that I would be involved in a few years ago. But it's one of those lovely stories of somebody's interest in a topic and the way that has snowballed. And I think when it comes to local history, when you get people involved, when you get people interested in a subject and a topic, it's amazing how quickly other people get involved, and you get other inputs, and you end up with something really interesting, really special, really important. And I think also as well in a city like Oxford, where sometimes you can go around the world and say you're from Oxford, but the version of Oxford that people think you're from is not the version that you're from. And I think in the big grand history of colleges, some of the local history, some of the local stories in this city can easily get overlooked. And this is one of those stories. And I know that things like hidden history and forgotten history are overlooked. And we had a lot of people last night, we may have some people in the audience here tonight who actually lived at Slade Park and know something about the camp and its history. And I always think that the history gets forgotten, but those people, they don't forget. It's just that we're the ones who don't remember it. So if tonight, this is a story about remembering a little part of Oxford and the story of how that came into being, and the history of a landscape, the history of people, the history of, it's not grand history, not big sweeping history, but I think it's something that really touches a chord with people when you live in a city and in a place. So I'll start off with, hopefully yes, it's going to work. Last night didn't work, it's worked tonight, which is good. I'll start off with this picture, and this is images from the first Slade Camp, Slade Park open day that we had in September 2024, part of the Oxford Preservation Trust, and we weren't sure how many people were going to turn up for this open day event. And you imagine open doors, the default idea in open doors is it's going to be something that involves the colleges, something within the bounds of the old city walls. So to do something like this, which is very much on the margins of Oxford, I'll explain a little bit more about where Slade Camp is in a moment, but something that's really on the margins of Oxford, we weren't really sure how many people were going to turn up. But fortunately, about 400 people turned up on the day. And throughout the day, we had 4 tour guides giving continuous hour tours that were completely oversubscribed, and we were walking around the site, showing them different aspects of the site, and also a big thank you to Oxford Preservation Trust for championing this cause and for championing Slade Camp and all the history. And I'll come on to the other events and the other associations that we've got with that organisation later. But we had these continuous rolling tour guides. This tour guide in particular, he was excellent. He was really good. You can see the crowd. He drew a huge crowd. He was really, really good. And we walked around Slade Camp, gave people some history, and the level of enthusiasm and interest was really surprising and also very gratifying as well. It really confirmed the fact that we knew that we were onto something quite special here. So what were all these people, these 400 people looking at? Well, they're looking at things like this. Some concrete and some rubble in the woods. And some people might say to yourself, this doesn't need research, this needs a skip. But beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and when you inject some life and some history into these objects, then they really do come to life. But we have got to say, that is a million miles away from that. That is the Oxford you carry around in your back pocket when you go travelling. So I'm from Oxford, everyone thinks, oh, you're from there. I always think this is the space that, I was born and brought up in Oxford, but grew up in Eddington. And it's a space that over the years I've come to realise that the centre of Oxford, very beautiful, very lovely, very lucky to live here, all those things. It's a space you walk around. A lot of those green spaces in the middle, they're not spaces you've got access to, not spaces you walk through as a matter of course, they're not shortcuts to anywhere. You tend to walk around Oxford. You don't walk through it because we don't have access to it. That's just the way it is, that's the town and gown thing. And I'll make sure that I really stick the boot into university whenever I possibly can. But it is very beautiful, but it is something that can be overwhelming. And the idea, you know, I often say to people when I do walking tours, you can always tell someone who's from Oxford if you ask them where a college is and they don't know, they're definitely from Oxford. Half the people don't know, where's Pembroke? I've got no idea at all, so I'm from here, you know. So you have this problem. So in that sort of sense, local history can get overlooked. And some of the grand histories, some of the big histories of the big colleges, you think, how is that relevant to me? And when you go to Slade Park and you go to Slade Camp and you walk around, these sort of muddy tracks in amongst the trees, they don't look very, you know, they don't look very appealing at first glance. But really, it's these tracks that hold a lot of stories, a lot of secrets, a lot of local history that really ties in with a different sort of Oxford, a more working class Oxford, a more industrial Oxford, an Oxford that doesn't really fit in with that Dreaming Spires narrative. So where do I fit into all of this? Well, I fit into all of this situation probably about a few years ago when a gentleman called Jim Woods, Jim was here last night, he's chairman of the Shotter Preservation Society. He came round, he called me and he said, I'd like to come round for a coffee, Maurice, and chat about a local history project. And he came round, he said, Maurice, I've come round, he said, because he said, I've heard you are the #1 expert on Slade Camp. And I said, Jim, you're right, absolutely, you're spot on in the right place. which was a bit of a lie because I knew nothing about Slade whatsoever. But I thought, you know, let's hear this guy out. And what Jim told me was that one of his neighbours on the Ridings, Jim lives on the Ridings, which if you don't know is if you go up the old road and you just before you get to the steep part of the hill, you do a right. That's the Ridings. It's a dead end road with some very nice houses on it. If you go down there. And Jim said, he said one of my neighbours, a woman called Wendy Austin. Wendy had lived on the Ridings since 1990, but during COVID, she had been walking around Slade Camp, and these pathways, these tarmac pathways, she should be walking around for well over 20 years and never really paid a lot of attention to those bricks and those pieces of concrete in the woods. She suddenly thought, in those dark days of COVID, well, what is this? What is this place? On my doorstep, I know nothing about it. There's no information boards here, but clearly this was something. You know, what is the story? So Wendy started to dig into that. And there's Wendy. A lot of yellow arrows in this part of the presentation. There's Wendy just there, standing in the front. And really, without Wendy, I wouldn't be standing on the stage tonight, and a lot of this project wouldn't happen. It's her curiosity, and it's been her drive and her passion and her interest in those bits of bricks and bits of concrete in the woods that has driven this whole project forward. And I think that's one of the lovely things about this. There is a proper grassroots story of somebody having an interest and then having the wherewithal and the gumption to go out and get other people involved. So I was intrigued by this because I grew up in Headington. I knew of Slade Camp. I knew there was this. I had a vague idea about it, but it's quite an isolated spot these days. So I don't really go there very often. So I was intrigued. So I thought I'd get involved. I was so involved. I'm in the picture. There I am in the picture just there at the back. And as a result of that, they said, "Oh, do you know anyone else who would be involved?" And I said, "Well, really, one of the people you should really be talking to is Liz Woolley." There's Liz just there. Liz gets her own arrow too. And if you don't know Liz, fantastic. She is the premier local historian in Oxford. And she's actually contractually obliged to get involved in all local history projects. The number of times I've been to places and people have said, "Do you know who could help?" And I've said, "Liz Woolley." And I tell you what, Liz Woolley, I think she must be inundated with emails on a daily basis. But Liz got involved, and Liz had recently done a project with Oxford Preservation Trust about Wood Farm. And the history of Wood Farm, that estate, is intrinsically linked with the history of Slade Camp and Slade Park. So Liz was a great fit to come in here. And also the fact she'd been involved in Wood Farm told me that Oxford Preservation Trust were interested in more local aspects of Oxford. So it seemed a really good fit. And this gathering, this was a gathering of people who were interested. I think this was September. Let me have a look. Yeah, this was March 2024. And also another person who got involved was another great local historian called Brian Lowe. Brian is great on military history, really, really good. He used to work at the car factory in Preston as a photographer. And I also wanted to give him a yellow arrow. When I looked at the picture for age, I was thinking, where's Brian? I can't see Brian. I remember Brian was taking the photograph. So Brian's not going to appear in this one, but Brian is fantastic. So that then led to a Facebook page, and people started to join the Facebook page, and through that social media, people started to join. It says on there's 101 members. There are actually, I think, 128 members now. People, some of them who lived at Slade Camp, some are just interested in Slade Camp, Slade Park, and it's a forum where people can share memories because a lot of people are dispersed around the country, share photographs, and that really has been the engine room that started off driving this project forward. So what I should really explain now is where Slade Camp actually is and where it sits into sort of the landscape of Oxford and the geography of Oxford. It's actually not too far away from here. If we were to go back up between Towns Road, and then we could do a left up Holloway, get to the end of Holloway and do a right by the Corner House pub, you're getting into the same territory. But I'll show you an old map to start off with. This is a map from 1797. The blue star is essentially where Slade Camp is. So you can see what's marked up there as New Road is actually the London Road. It's marked as New Road because it was the new turnpike road that replaces Old Road. Old Road was the original coaching road, overshot over the main thoroughfare to London. That's the road that Queen Elizabeth I would have travelled, that Shakespeare would have travelled to get to Oxford. But the New Road is the London Road, going through what was then the small village of Headington. not far from the small village of Barton, Sandhill and Forest Hill. This was a place very much on the margins of Oxford. You can see down here, this marking here, this is the old city walls. This is the countryside. This is Wurzel territory out here. And the mark here, you can see Shotover as well, clearly marked, and also two woodlands, Brasenose Woods and Magdalen Woods. And this is pretty ancient. This is pretty ancient land. But again, this is farmland. This is not part of Oxford itself. Headington wasn't incorporated into the city of Oxford until 1938-39. So these are places that are very much on the margins of Oxford itself. But fast forward a little bit more. This is a great photograph. This is, I think, taken by the American Air Force in 1943, and this is the same area. And it's a bit confusing. When I looked at this map, I was thinking, well, this isn't Oxford. This is whereabouts is this? It's a bit tricky because Oxford has changed an awful lot. So what I've done is I've handily marked up a few things. The green road up there is Old Road. That is Quarry Road just here. This is the Churchill Hospital just here. This is the Cowley Works here. This is the area where Slade Camp is. Lye Valley just here. The Slade here, and we quite handily are just here on Florence Park. It's Florence Park. It's just been built. One of the new estates. So zooming in again, Churchill Hospital. I do a lot of arrows. Churchill Hospital here is the blue arrow. Slade Camp is the other blue arrow just here. And this is the Ridings at the back. This is the Ridings just here that leads down to Slade Camp now. Zoom in again. This is the remains of Brasenose Farmhouse. It is now the fancy kitchen shop that is opposite Aldi. Yeah? Some good nods there. The fancy kitchen shop, go to Aldi, yeah. You can all aspire to buy a kitchen from there. The blue arrow here is where the Corner House pub is. So this is Holloway here, this is the Slade just here. And I did say to somebody kept saying you kept referencing the Corner House pub last night. No, I'm not obsessed with the Corner House pub, it's a very, very handy marker for this. And the Corner House pub would have been Southfield Golf Course. Well, Southfield, that shows my age. Oxford Golf Course just here as well. And the Corner House pub would have been the entranceway to Slade Camp. And Slade Camp would have gone up from the bottom of the Slade here, all the way up to the Ridings here. So it's a big area of land. One of the reasons why it's difficult to orientate yourself is that what isn't in this picture is the bypass. The bypass goes straight through the middle of Slade Camp. There's the Corner House pub handily marked again, so that gives you a sense of everything. But as in, and I'll talk about this later, the bypass is such a transformative thing in Oxford. It cuts off so many communities. It really redefines Oxford in so many ways. So if you could imagine, Shotover would have been a place that would have been very, very close, very, very connected to where we are now. Now it's you have to get to it across 4 lanes of traffic. But if you go back to this landscape, and you go back to this painting here, this is a painting from 1791 by John Melcher. This is a view from the top of Shotover Hill. So this is the top of Shotover Hill. There's the city of Oxford in the distance, and again that sense of openness in between Shotover and the old city walls. Again, this is a rural area, and this is the historic gateway into Oxford. And Shotover itself would have been, well, in fact, if you go to the top of Shotover, there's an old mounting stone at the top of there. I think it's from 1630, where you would have got off your horse, walked up with the horse, or you'd have walked up behind the coaching wagon. You've got back onto your vehicle or your horse. It's still there at the top. And timber on the slopes of Shotover would have been used for college buildings. They would have been used for naval ships. It was also a very old historic royal hunting ground for many years. And during the Civil War, it was used by the Roundheads as a staging point for the siege of Oxford. So it's a really interesting historic place. More importantly than that, though, it's a really old bit. And I always really enjoy saying this, is that this part of Oxford is the really old part of Oxford. If you're looking for Roman ruins in Oxford, keep on looking, because the Romans were not interested in the centre of Oxford at all, a damp, swampy place. There's a lovely quote I use in my Headington talk where they say, the air in Oxford is stale beer, the air in Headington is pure champagne. So, you're sort of halfway up the hill here, not full Headington, But this is the oldest part. The Romans were interested in this part of town. So if you were to look at the old Roman road, there's an old Roman road that ran from Dorchester upon Thames linking the River Thames up to a place called Alchester, which was a Roman settlement just south of Bicester, and this was a connecting road that connects onto Ackerman Street, Fosse Way, some of the other big Roman roads. But it was a very important trading road, and along this road there were lots of kilns, lots of pottery was produced, very famous pottery. The item there on the right hand side is called a mortarium, which was a kitchen vessel, was produced in huge quantity in this area, and that would have been at kilns and places like, well, they found the remains of kilns at Blackbird Leeds, Cowley, the Churchill Hospital site. When they just knocked down the Conservative Club quite recently, they found evidence of Roman pottery there. Also on the foothills of Shotover as well, evidence of Roman kilns found in quarry, evidence of this pottery, and these items have been found all over Europe. They've been found in Paris, in Bruges, Scotland. So there's a little bit of Shotover, a little bit of Cowley, all over Europe, thanks to the Romans. And that's because on Shotover as well, there's a rich theme of Kimmeridge clay, and also a ready supply of fuel. So if you want to make pottery, you've got the clay, you've got the fuel. It's absolutely, it is the perfect combination. Now, the Roman, and also as well, just to point out, there were significant Roman villas at Beckley and at Barton. So, you know, if you want the old bit of Oxford, go to Beckley and Barton. Don't bother with that stuff in the middle of town. I always think it's interesting for a place that trades, for a place that trades on its history. The fact they haven't got any Roman stuff must really bug them. Where is the Roman road? Well, if you walk behind the BMW factory, there's a very straight road that's called Roman Way. So there's a really big clue just there. So next time you go up the Horsepath Road, just take a look to your right, dead straight road, Roman Way. And really, Roman Way goes straight through the middle of Slade Camp. I've done this nice little yellow graphic there. Can you guess what the red blue arrow's for? It's the Cornhouse Pub. Yes, the Cornhouse Pub is there. Not in Roman times though, as far as I know. But yes, so the Roman road runs right through the middle of the camp. Looking at the map that I showed earlier from 1943, that is a rough representation about where the Roman road goes. It sort of follows the route of the bypass. It is in that general direction. If you go back here, that is Brasenose farmhouse. That is Brasenose farmhouse just here, the fancy kitchen shop. And if you go back to the 19th century, this would still have been a place that would have been a big open place. That would have been a place that would have been particularly cultivated. Unfortunately, I can't do this at all. Of course you can.
It's not where it is now.
No. Right.
Do you know anything about why it's there?
No. That's my homework. That is the next one I can do. Yeah, I'm more than happy to do the investigation work. Yeah. But if you talk about these areas, you talk about Open Magdalen, Open Brasenose. Sadly, we cannot continue without mentioning the university because they are huge landowners. So to put this area in context, we have to briefly explore this. So Magdalen College acquired Open Magdalen at the time of its foundation in 1458 as part of the lands which had been owned by the Hospital of St George, which were passed on to Magdalen by the college's founder, William Wainfleet. If you go to Wainfleet Road on Barton, it's named after William Wainfleet. So next time you're on Barton, check that one out. Now, Brasenose College acquired Open Brasenose in the early 16th century and managed the woodland by letting on a series of long leases, about 20 years. Now, there were 4 open areas near Headington Quarry, collectively known to local people as the Moors. And these comprised of Open Magdalen, Open Brasenose, the Ridings and Slade Common. And this was a big area of open land in between Headington and Cowley. Now, none of this land was officially common land, but common rights were exercised over it by the villagers of Headington and Cowley, who cut fuel, grazed cattle, foraged, poached, and also there was a big history of gypsies using this area, possibly in conjunction with the old Roman road, the old Roman travelling routes. Certainly, there's a history, there's an association with gypsies in this area. If you go down to near Cheney School, that's on Gypsy Lane. That speaks for itself. Cinnaminter Road, very close, not too far away from here. Cinnaminter Road is named after a gypsy princess, so there's a nice sort of interest in there. Now, what you what you find is that there was always a series of disputes over this land, over ownership of this land, and that came to a head really in the late 18th century, 19th century during the Enclosure Acts, where gradually land was given over to different ownership, and it really came to a head around this area in the mid 19th century when a new farmer takes over this area, and it was a gentleman called Richard Pether. In 1849, he took over the lease of Wood Farm. Now, Wood Farm wasn't an estate then; it was actually a farm. And together with Open Magdalen, and he did that. He took that lease over in Magdalen College. Now, later in the 1880s, Richard Pether took over the lease of Brasenose Farm from Brasenose College, so he's in control of all of this land. Now, Pether had all manner of issues with the locals, especially with the people of Headington Quarry. He fenced off land, they knocked down the fences. He plants up trees, he pulled them up. And they had total disregard for his ownership and control of the land. To give you an idea about what this land looked like, this is a picture from 1914. Now this is the Lye Valley, looking towards Holloway. So this is Cowley Barracks in the distance, and you can see this is just farmland. As late as 1914, this was a big, huge open space. Around the same time, Brasenose Farmhouse looked a little bit like this. And if you're thinking, whereabouts is this, Maurice? Well, this is Brasenose Farmhouse today. So again, this big rural area. So Richard Pether had all of these disputes with the people of Headington Quarry, and eventually, in order to stop the people of Headington Quarry being such a nuisance to him, they eventually gave them the land that is now Quarry Recreation Ground. So if you ever go to Quarry Recreation Ground on Margaret Road, you think this is a nice piece of land. It was given as a bribe to the people of Headington Quarry to stop being a nuisance. Also, the first place where Oxford United had their ground was just there. So, Richard Pether, despite the fact he was very unpopular with the people of Headington Quarry, is buried in Headington Quarry churchyard. And in one of those strange historical twists, Richard Pether turns out to be the maternal grandfather of William Maurice, the industrialist. Now, I'm contractually obliged to mention William Maurice in every single talk I do, but as I think you'll find out of the next talk, you cannot talk about the history of the 20th century. You can't talk about changes in Oxford without talking about William Maurice. And William Maurice, as a child, would have spent a lot of time with his grandfather in and around this area. His grandmother was actually from Headington Quarry. He himself grew up a stone's throw from here in Church Cowley. So he was very much a local lad, very much an outdoor lad. So he would have spent a huge amount of time wandering around these big open fields. When he earned his fortune in the 20s and 30s, he was so infatuated or so enthralled with this area that he decided to buy it. So, on the 4th of April 1934, Magdalen College sold Lord Nuffield all the lands of Wood Farm, comprising a farmhouse, useful buildings, 3 cottages, and just over 183 acres of land, including Open Magdalen. He did that, then they sold him that for £26,000. And Nuffield agreed at all times thereafter to preserve as a permanent open space or open spaces the present Magdalen Wood. In 1935, Brasenose College sold Brasenose Wood to the city of Oxford. So we've got this big change in ownership, and also there are some other big changes on the horizon, because in the 1930s, you have the start of a very tumultuous decade. Now, luckily in Europe today, we don't have any dangerous, aggressive dictators looking to acquire land. But if you can imagine that, just try as hard as you can to imagine that. And the approach of the First World War was going to have an impact on Oxford. Not least because William Maurice had started up a huge industrial plant that was potentially going to make the city, this old medieval city, a target for the Luftwaffe. The other thing Oxford needed, or was deemed to need it by the military, was an extra army camp. So the original barracks are on Holloway, just down here. I'm not the corner house. You're not the corner house, just in case you know. So these are the original barracks now on Holloway. They're now Brooks accommodation. Back then they would have looked like this. Very grand. This amazing tower was actually only knocked down in 1970, but it was a huge big grand barracks. It was home to the Ox and Bucks Regiment. Very extensive parade grounds, other facilities, training grounds, and it was decided that this needed an extension. It needed greater capacity. With the approach of war, there was a sense that the ox and bucks were going to be come into play, and they would need more, and they would need more space. And remember as well, at this stage, this is all open land. So essentially, it would have been a short walk to get from the barracks, just down here, over to Slade Camp. A very short, a really short walk. Now, some of you might remember that there was the TA Centre. So the TA Centre was knocked down, I think, in 2008, and the TA Centre was a remnant, a hangover of Slade Camp. So that was very much the main entrance to Slade Camp down there, and that was like I say, you can still see some of the regimental insignia there. So in 1939, the land for Slade Camp was requisitioned for a military camp, and it's unclear if William Maurice sold the land or gave it away, but it was very much going to be an extension of Cowley Barracks. Now, if you look at the camp design, it looks from above like it is totally haphazard. You can see these network of roads, but it looks as if all the huts, all the various military installations have been placed in a very, very haphazard way. Compare it down there to the military barracks there, that looks very, very different. But you're dealing with two very different ages. This is very much a 19th century construction. This is a construction that takes into account attack from above. This is not vulnerable to attack from above. This one is. So this is a deliberate pattern by the military, a dispersal pattern, to mean that if this area does get bombed, then there is an attempt to minimise the damage. So a lot of people think, God, they've just thrown the huts down. This is a very deliberate act. And if you look at other camps at the same time, they all follow this very, very similar pattern. And the camp as well would have followed other military rules. It would have had regulation with military roads. Brian, like I say, one of my colleagues, a great military historian, will tell you that you can measure the roads on Slade Camp, and they exactly fit the military regulations, because it takes a certain level of truck or tank or whatever military vehicle it is. And there would have been long wooden barracks there of different sizes for to hold military personnel. There would have been alongside brick structures, ammunition dump. There was a shooting range. There was an assault course, and the way that the camp was organised was along an avenue system. So there's nothing fancy. It's just First Avenue, Second Avenue, Third Avenue. Very, 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 very efficient in that way. So the camp opens in March 1940 as Infantry Training Centre number 16. Not the sexiest of titles, but that's what it is. And the expectation is this is going to be used to train extra troops that are going to be required to fight the upcoming war. Now, I talked about a dispersal pattern. And it's very easy to think about Oxford and think, well, we didn't need a dispersal pattern because Oxford wasn't bombed. As I often say at this point, they didn't know that. Nobody knew that Oxford wasn't going to be bombed. It was certainly looking like it was a very big target, because in the interwar years, really from 1919 onwards, the works at Cowley had expanded massively. There had been a huge influx of workers from all over the country. The press steel factory had been opened in 1926. This had gone from really being a rural, semi-rural backwater dominated by the university to being this huge, big industrial hub. And the Second World War was going to be an industrial war, and this facility was turned over to war production and was clearly going to be a target. And also the whole of Oxford really was turned over to a war footing. So there was a full blackout in Oxford. There was a full expectation that Oxford was going to be bombed. Now, this is my grandfather's air raid precautions. He worked at Maurice Motors during the Second World War. This is his air raid instructions, the instructions to employees. And again, I've seen maps as well that are in the town hall of the precautions that were taken across the factory, bomb shelters being installed, that sort of thing. So war's declared on the 3rd of September 1939, and the first air raid warning in Oxford is sounded on the 6th of September 1939. There are full preparations. The Western Library on Broad Street is turned into a deep air raid shelter. The Churchill Hospital was built in the full expectation of taking on civilian casualties. As I say, there would have been a full back out, there would have been fire wardens on the top of all the tall buildings in the centre of Oxford, there would have been searchlights, there were various gun batteries around the town, big, huge pipes were laid in the gutters in the centre of Oxford for firefighting. The expectation was that Oxford really would be bombed, and certainly the Luftwaffe knew where Oxford was. There's often these sort of myths that appear. This is a Luftwaffe map that appeared after the Second World War, marked with my trademark blue arrow, as Maurice Motors works. This is Slade Camp and the barracks. So, and this was denoted on the map. So, in terms of military targets, the Germans had two very close. They had the works at Cowley, and they had some regimental barracks as well. Now, that's a whole separate talk about why Oxford wasn't bombed. But certainly the expectation was very much, given what happened in Coventry and Birmingham and other centres, planes, you talk to people at the time, planes were flying over Oxford to get to these places. The fact they didn't bomb Oxford is a question of luck and strategy, really. And it's fair to say that in the early part, and also just to say this is a fascinating bomb map. This is a bomb map of Oxfordshire. Oxford was reasonably heavily bombed. There were over nearly 4,000 bombs dropped on Oxfordshire of all types, caused 20 deaths, 60 casualties, 300 houses were damaged. And as I say, there was a full expectation that this bomb map would be centred on Oxford as well. And it's fair to say, though, in the early part of the war, that things were not going very well for us. From May to June 1940, you had the evacuation, Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Dunkirk. And very much this would have been brought home to the people in Oxford, because instrumental in defending that evacuation were the Ox and Bucks Regiment. They were tasked with three main theatres of operation. They were at Castle, at Havensbrook, and at Verton, just here, and they held the line. And they were stationed as the evacuations were going on. They fought rearguard action against panzer divisions to hold them back. They took very, very heavy casualties. Half the battalion was lost. Only 4 soldiers from 2 groups of the 4th Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry that were at Castle actually returned home. Many others were captured. So that really was a very, very harsh lesson that would have brought home to the people of Oxford that a war was on, where their local regiment was in so much action. Now, the men who were being withdrawn from this coast arrived back in the UK, and I watched quite recently the film Dunkirk, and that concludes with men returning home with the full expectation that they're going to be subject to abuse from people back in England, because the scale of the defeat and the retreat had been so humiliating. What's interesting is that when the soldiers did return from France in this demoralised state, I often look at that gentleman's face just there. I think that tells you all you need to know. Approximately 10,000 troops were sent to be processed in Oxford at Cowley Barracks and Slade Camp. And as I say, this again would have brought home the reality of the situation to people of Oxford. This is a recollection from Michael Hickey, who was a schoolboy at the time. He was at Magdalen College School, and he wrote in his diary, "We gazed in amazement as for 2 days columns of exhausted troops marched across Magdalen Bridge. In transit from the barracks at Cowley, where they had presumably been fed and watered, and onto trains, taking them all over the country, where they would have been cleaned up, issued with new uniforms and weapons, and assigned to their units as the nation prepared itself for German invasion." And he goes on in his diary to talk about some of the men actually in rags, wearing pieces of French uniform. None of them had guns. I mean, it's very, very desperate times. It was fully expected at this time that this country was going to be invaded. That was the next stage. That was the next stage of the German campaign. And Oxford, the country itself, was pretty poorly defended. There was really just the 1st Canadian Infantry Division based in the UK. And interestingly enough, their advanced headquarters were at Shotover Hall. Shotover Hall is on the way to Wheatley. It's kind of tucked away, but it's this rather splendid house. It was taken over by the Canadians in June 1940, and effectively they were the only division equipped to fight any sort of invasion at this time, and they were seen as being crucial for the defence of this country. And there were thousands and thousands of Canadians billeted and stationed all over Oxfordshire. And as I say, this was their advanced HQ. Also, Oxford was key for the series of stop lines that were being introduced. Stop lines were points that were identified often against natural barriers. In Oxfordshire and in Berkshire, it was the River Thames. That was seen as a stop line that could potentially hold up the Germans in place in the invasion. If you walk along some of these stop lines, you'll see, you wander in the countryside, you'll see a huge big concrete structure in the middle of nowhere. They're often the remnants of these stop lines that were there with going to be this sort of last fortification. If you move on to what was going on at the car factory, well, the car factory had been completely turned over to the war effort. Big opportunities for women, and the factory was turning out everything you could possibly imagine, from jerry cans to tin helmets, to torpedoes, to mine sinkers, to ammunition. One of the key things they did was build Tiger Moth planes. They were building 300 of those a week at peak production, because if you need pilots, you need pilots to go through a training process. So they were producing thousands of these planes. And also remember, these were car workers who were being switched over to being aircraft engineers in very, very short order. What was achieved at the car factory is often greatly overlooked. Perhaps because Oxford wasn't bombed, it didn't have any visible scars. But believe me, the things that were going on here were stupendous. There was also an airfield at Cowley. That was to facilitate the landing of Hurricanes and Spitfires damaged during the Battle of Britain, and they were given immediate repairs, or they would get overnight repairs. Huge amounts of work. If you're old enough to remember the two big chimneys that were basically where the Beefeater is at Bottom of Garsington Road. So the factory was turned over fully into war production. As I say, it was repairing planes, also making tanks. These tanks were used in action at Al Alamein. In fact, some of the guys who worked on the tanks were sent to the desert to maintain them. And also, for Shotover, they were being tested, and they were being run out at Shotover. So you probably recognise where this is. This is right at the top of Shotover. These trees still exist. It's still very thin. No tanks up there at the moment, as far as I know. Now, what was going on at Slade Camp at this time? Now, I can't lie with you. It's all a bit of an anticlimax, because the camp has been built in the expectation it's going to be required for training, it's going to be required for extra capacity. Whether it was because the regiment, the Oxford Bucks regiment, was so badly affected by the actions at Dunkirk, I don't know. But not a lot happens at Slade Camp at all. It's all a bit superfluous to requirements. One report states that in April 1941, the huts at Slade Camp were almost deserted. In May 1941, there was an intake of troops for training, and also in the ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, and women's branch of the British military were stationed at the camp for a few months, and the huts were converted for women's use. This is one of the only photographs we have of what the inside of the camps looked at military use. You can see not a lot of space between the beds, I'd wager, so quite cosy in there. Now, contrary to popular belief, the camp was not used by the American forces as a staging post for the preparation for D-Day. You often hear that. And at the end of the war, the camp became number 2 military disembarkation camp unit for all Southern Command soldiers arrived at Slade Camp to make the transition back into civilian life. This amounted to a grant of money, underclothes, shirts, hat, raincoat, shoes, and the famous D-Mob suit that most soldiers said made them look like gangsters. So I think it's fair to say that what would happen is, I don't think Brad Pitt's going to star in a film about Slade Camp, to be honest with you. But as is the way of any preparations for war, the expectation is to over-prepare. So Slade Camp was built in the expectation of something happened. As it wasn't needed, but it does fit in. It had a role during Dunkirk, had a role afterwards. It was there if required, but yes, I'm afraid there's no sort of great daring do's coming out of it. But if you imagine the area around Shotover, imagine this part of the city, you would have had what was going on at the car factory would have been constant 24-hour shifts of work, planes flying in for repair. There would have been the Canadians staged up at Shotover, the barracks for the Oxford Bucks as well. This would have been an area that would have been very militarised. There would have been security, soldiers everywhere. There would have been sentries everywhere. It would have been a very militarised, important part of Oxford during this time, as was the centre of Oxford as well. And I'll briefly touch on that later. But if you look after the war in 1947, this is looking from the riding. So this is looking from Shotover down towards where we are now. Blue arrow is the car works in the distance. This road is the ridings along here, on the foothills of Shotover, and here's the camp in its entirety, stretching down from the ridings towards the Cornerhouse pub. I couldn't find the Cornerhouse pub. And interestingly enough, what's happened was the factory has survived the war unscathed. It hasn't been bombed. And before the war, Oxford had been a boomtown. Well, suddenly, this car factory that had actually expanded during the war was now a very simple task for it to be retooled, and it could start up with the efforts to start producing goods again, to export to the empire again, and that in itself it becomes a huge attraction for extra workers. This is looking along. The well, we're not far. We're just over here. This is St Luke's Church at the top of Twin Towns Road. The original Swan pub is just over there. Holloway up here. Maurice's original factory, which is still there on the corner. Stretching up here, this is now an innovation cluster. Just here. Anyone know what an innovation cluster is? No, nor do I. But it's an innovation cluster here. And the factory would have been on both sides of the road, North Works, South Works, leading down to the Press Steel factory, which is now BMW, which is the only part of the works that survived. Tens of thousands of people working here. No bypass. That circle just there is the Greyhound and Speedway track, and over there it's going to where Belize is going to be built. And also a fully functioning railway line that would have run all the way through. And again, key for the factory, had a fully functioning railway line, very good for exports. This is perfect. It's not been bombed. It can simply get up and start again. And as I say in other talks, I always think that Oxford really in that interwar period was Detroit-on-Thames. It was a boomtown. It was a magnet for people from all over the country, from declining industries in South Wales, the coal mines, from shipyards in the northeast of England, from steelworks in Sheffield, from steelworks in Scotland, from all over the place. People flocked to Oxford because of the jobs and their opportunities in this city. So huge expansion eastwards in that time, and really this part of Oxford, the industrial part of Oxford, had come to dominate the old medieval part of the city. But however, the problems that existed before the war, in terms of housing, they'd not been fixed during the war. Estates like here, like Florence Park, had been built, and the construction of Rose Hill had been started to meet the demand of the influx of people who were coming in, not just car workers, but also support workers for the car workers as well. But building work had stalled during the World War II, and there was just inadequate provision. So in October 1940, the City Council had about 3,000 families on its housing application register. In 1946, the number on that register had risen to 5,000. There was a severe lack of housing in Oxford, and some people were living on virtual squatter camps around the outskirts of the city. For example, people were illegally occupying Nissen huts on Cheney Lane and at Headington Hill Hall. And this was part of a national phenomenon. There was an adequate number of housing, and there's extra pressure was being put on because, as in the rest of the country, not only we'd lost houses through bombing, but there'd been no real construction work during the Second World War. Suddenly you had 3.5 million returning ex-servicemen, you had a baby boom, and you had people demanding something better for themselves. Now, in 1946, a social action group was formed in Brighton called the Secret Committee of Ex-Servicemen. It was also known as the Brighton Vigilantes. The group facilitated and encouraged the occupation of empty privately owned properties, and their ideas spread quickly around the UK. And there were mass demonstrations in the centre of London and other towns. People were dissatisfied. I think a general sense of, well, we've not fought a war for this. And also there's a slight militancy, a slight mood that within the election of a Labour government after the end of the war, that people were not going to settle for what was happening previously. They weren't going to be so compliant. They were actually going to enforce their rights. So from May 1946, a new phase began, the squatting of empty army camps. All over the country, there were redundant army and air force camps with Nissen huts and other buildings. They were very rudimentary, but people were desperate to get a roof over their heads. Other places started to be taken over, like schools, hotels, old air raid shelters, cinemas, grand houses, even a Greyhound stadium. And an organisation was formed called the Squatters Protection Society, and the movement kept on going. In 1946, it was estimated that 46,000 people were occupying disused military camps, and the BBC noted there was a strange mood of orderly lawlessness, which had its own momentum. Now, the squatting of army bases was certainly a challenge to the government, but the Labour government tried to act as carefully and respectfully as it could. It didn't want to be the government that kicked out war heroes, ex-servicemen. And also a lot of this agitation was being driven by ex-servicemen who were socialists, who were left-wing, and actually wanted some sort of serious change. So what the Labour government did, that often they would say the squatters could stay on a short-term basis. They would reconnect basic facilities like power and water, and many of the squatted camps received funding from local councils and the Exchequer. And it had general support amongst the people. They were not seen as being criminal acts. Now, on the 17th of October 1946, the Times, no less, reported more huts formerly used by the services in various parts of the country were occupied by homeless families yesterday. After commandeering huts at the rocket battery site at Cowley Marsh, Oxford, squatters extended their activities to the ex-Admiralty huts on Balliol College ground at Jowett's Walk. Now, the rocket battery site had been installed to protect the works at Cowley, just down the road, a stone's throw from here. The Balliol huts at Jowett's Walk in the town centre had been part of the Whitehall takeover of Oxford during the war. Now, lots of government departments had moved out to Oxford during the war. They'd used the facilities at Oxford University, used the expertise at Oxford University. There's a great book called Oxford at War by Ashley Jackson that I encourage you to read. It gives a really full account of especially the university's contribution during those war years. Really fascinating. And the Admiralty have been based around Jowett's Walk, and obviously they'd used temporary accommodation. Now, this is from Manchester Harris, Harris Manchester College's website. They're on Mansfield Road, so not far from Jowett's Walk. This is on their history bit of their website. The university, meanwhile, thought the Manchester huts might accommodate a homeless institution, the Institute of Statistics being suggested. But the college saw the removal of the huts as a priority. There was an overwhelming desire to get back to normal, and fears that squatters would requisition them as they had done those on the nearby Balliol ground. So, for Harris Manchester, a homeless university department was bad enough, but actual homeless people coming onto their site, now that was just a step too far. They weren't going to have that. So these huts were very quickly removed. And it goes on. The college then, in 1947, a detailed schedule of dilapidations was produced as the college sought government compensation for damage and wear and tear. The Carpenter Library needed reglazing, removal of notice boards, plugging of holes, new lino and floor repairs. The mosaic floor in the library needed repair, and the SCR, new brass sash window lists, were required, along with corded cleats. The Yale locks needed to be removed, and the cost of a new WC pan for the ladies' lavatory was claimed. So too were repairs to the organ, which had been seriously affected by the Admiralty's persistent overheating of the chapel. In March 1947, the principal wrote there was still lots to be done, including the planing and polishing of the library and hall floors, the cleaning of the stonework, and the breaking up of the concrete foundation of the now removed huts, to be followed by the restoration of the lawns. Well, get your priorities right. Let's get back to normal. Let's not worry too much about the homeless people around there. Let's get those lawns reinstated. Anyway, that's my chippy bit about the university, but it does show you sort of very clearly that there were different priorities in that post-war era. And for the university and for Oxford, it was returning to normal, returning to their normal way of things. But there were other problems on this side of Oxford that needed attending to. Now, this is the picture here of the blue arrow there is Slade Camp in the background. This is the Slade. This is the Slade Road here. We're now looking from sort of the Headington Quarry side. This is Old Road leading up to Shotover. This is Quarry Road. This is where Wood Farm Estate would eventually be. This construction just here is a POW camp. Now, this is Wood Farm Camp, often confused with the Slade Camp. Many people will say to you that Slade Camp was a POW camp. It never was. The Old Road POW camp was constructed on 1944 on land requisitioned from William Maurice. First Italian prisoners were housed there, and then it was used for German prisoners, and it was a denazification camp. Now, in the summer of 1947, before all the German prisoners departed, Oxford City Council began to look into the possibility of using it to house local people who were otherwise homeless. In June 1947, the city's architect department drew up plans for the conversion of the existing huts at the Old Road POW camp into housing for the squatters, the homeless people, at Hennington Hill Hall and Cheney Lane. They were also going to prevent this from being unauthorised squatting, so we're going to make sure that the people who were already squatting, they weren't going to be pushed behind, they were going to be first in the queue. And the land at Wood Farm on the camp was compulsory purchase from Lord Nuffield. So a delegation of Hensier Hall and Cheney squatters met with the chief sanitary inspector and the deputy town clerk to ask whether they could move into Old Road Camp before winter, as their present accommodation was cold and damp. They were told they would not be able to move into the following spring, but in the meantime improvement being made by the council to their current accommodation. Now Harry Plowman, the town clerk, oversaw plans for the improvements of the camp, the POW camp at Old Road. And these plans were conversion. You can see here they're held at the town hall. There were surveyors' reports and a detailed schedule of what was going to happen, and the works were put up to tender. Once the last German POWs had left in early 48, Sim & Co set about converting the camp into 31 two-bedroom and 3 three-bedroom flats. The rents were set at 8 shillings per week plus rates. The two-bedroom flats for 9 and 10 shillings plus the rates for the three-bed flats. So what you find here is this is going to be the template for the conversion of Slade Camp, because if this squatting was going to extend, if this pressure was going to extend, the council knew they had to do something, and the conversion of the flats, the conversion of the huts at the POW camp at Old Road, that was to become the template for what happened afterwards and how Slade Camp was then transformed into its own community.